Okay, let's go ahead and start this next unit. It's going to be on plasma membranes. So, when you guys looked at cells, one of the organelles you probably had to learn about was the plasma membrane. So, the plasma membrane is kind of like, I want you to imagine that I have a sort of a little pond or a little, I don't know, big bucket of water, and there are little, I don't know, little sort of plastic hollow balls floating in it. Okay, that kind of models a little bit about what it would sort of feel like. All these would be very, very close together. So these would be like, say they're all ping pong balls floating on water. These things can move around on the surface of the cell. The surface of the cell is really like those ping pong balls, okay? As far as things moving around. Now, it's a little bit more complex than that because the ping pong balls have these little tails that come off of them, and we're going to kind of look at how that's set up. But I really want you to understand that these things can flow around. So if you were sort of, I don't know, if you like watched a cell and you watched one of these, it would move around throughout the membrane, okay? So those are very flexible. The membrane is very dynamic. It's not like a brick wall where the bricks don't move, okay? It's more like those floating ping pong balls. If you reached your hand in there, it would separate and then it would come back together. All right, so the main thing about the plasma membrane is I have down here, it's the gateway of the cell. It's going to keep things that shouldn't be in the cell on the outside, and it's going to let things that the cell needs on the inside. So it's kind of like a gatekeeper. So here is a microscope. This is an electron microscope picture of the cell membrane. And you see, if you look very carefully, you see two lines right there. Because the cell membrane is a double layer. And if we go back to this picture here, you can kind of see there's a layer here and a layer here. And that's what I'm showing you in this picture. So let's look at what the cell membrane, like a little bit more about its purpose. So, like I said, it's flexible, okay? So it can move around. It's not like a brick wall. If you're a unicellular, let's say you're just one single cell, the plasma membrane can move, okay? So we can send out sort of extensions of the plasma membrane that allows it to sort of blob around. So that's very useful if you only have one cell. The other big function of the plasma membrane is to maintain homeostasis. This word means same. So homeo means same, and stasis I think of like status, okay? So same state. You don't want your cells to kind of wildly swing around on how they are, their chemical environment needs to stay steady, okay? So we use that membrane to keep the internal conditions of the cell balanced, okay? I like to think of this like a kitchen. Let's say you're going to make a big meal for your family, and it's going to have, a vegetable, some sort of main course, and a dessert. You need to keep the ingredients. Let's say you're going to have a cake for dessert and you're going to have a salad. You don't want to mix the cake batter with the salad. You need to keep each individual dish balanced. That's kind of how cell membranes are. We don't want to mix the cake with the salad. We don't want to mix the main dish. Maybe let's say it's going to be lasagna. You don't want to pour cake batter into your lasagna. Okay, so basically, each individual cell, you want to maintain a certain set of conditions. You want to do the same thing in the kitchen. So that's kind of a little bit of an analogy for how this works. This is also called equilibrium. We want to keep the cell in this state where it's able to do its job. How do we do that? Well, just like you control what you put in your lasagna, what you put in your cake, and what you put in your salad, the membrane is kind of like you picking what to put in each one of those sets of food you're going to prepare. So you might only put lettuce, tomato, cheese, and dressing in the salad. You're going to maintain control of what goes into it. That's the same thing that the plasma membrane does. It controls what enters and it controls what leaves the cell. All right. So let's take a look at some of the things it does one by one. So it makes a protective barrier. Right now we're living in a world where a virus is attacking our whole society. If you can keep that virus out of the inside of your cells, that's a good thing. You won't get sick. So there are certain things we don't want to let into cells. Okay? But there are certain things you do want to let into cells. So the membrane regulates things that should go in and out. We call that selectively permeable. Now, permeable means something can get through, okay? Selectively. If I said that you were looking for a date, but you were very selective about who you went on your date with, that means you're not going to just go on a date with the first person you meet. You're going to pick out someone who has certain traits that you really like. So you're going to be selective. And so what selectively permeable means is the cell is going to be very picky, just like you with your date, about what it lets in. This thing's not just going to let any old chemical, any old molecule pass through. It's going to pick the things it needs to get in and out. The other thing the membrane does, there are little carbohydrate, and they kind of look like this. They'll be like little chains of sugars on the surface of the cell, and those allow other cells in your immune system especially to recognize that that cell is part of your body. If you've got a liver transplant from somebody who wasn't a good match, these tags will be very different. And your body is going to say, those cells don't belong to us. Let's have the immune system attack them. If you have an autoimmune disease where your body is attacking its own cells, it may be about recognizing what's going on here. All right, some other things. Some cells want to keep a very specific shape, and there are parts of the cytoskeleton that will anchor to that membrane on the inside and keep that cell shape in a steady state. So we got a lot of things that your cell membrane does, but the main one is, I would say, this one here. This is the one we're going to worry about the most. What goes in and what goes out. So, some other things that we're going to look at. These are more functions. Cells often have interactions with chemicals in the environment. And so, if you go back, I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning. Nice picture here. There are certain proteins that will float in the cell. Here are those carbohydrates that I just talked about. When these guys are floating in the cell, there may be chemical signals that attach to these. So you may have some particle come in and attach to this. And that's like going to turn something in the cell on or off, okay? So when this comes in and attaches to that protein, it might send a signal to your cell to say, let sugar in, or let water out, or make this enzyme. So we want to really kind of understand that the cell is covered in switches. And those switches are proteins that float in the membrane and allow the cell to change its job, its function, based on what's happening around the cell. So that's what we're talking about here. Some cells will have little fibers that hold them together. So some cells, it's very important for them to maintain their shape and where they're at. And it's really, really simple. The cell membrane stops things from leaking out, okay? So just another look at it here. We have proteins that have holes in them that allow things to pass through. We have proteins that have sort of binding sites for signals that get picked up. So that might be some molecule that says, okay, cell, you need to do something different. So there's all sorts of different things floating within the cell membrane, and these can also move around in here. All right, here's another look at it. Some of these proteins, like here would be like a binding site. If this triangle-shaped substance bonded with these, it might change how the cell behaves, okay? We talked about the cytoskeleton holding the cell together. You can see that right here, okay? So you also in this picture see cholesterol right here. Cholesterol helps the membrane keep its shape, found mainly in animal cells. So this is sort of what the membrane looks like. Now, probably one of the most important parts of the membrane are phospholipids. Let's talk about those for a second. So phospholipids, this is a diagram of their chemical formula. You never have to memorize this, okay? But what I want you to see here is there's a polar side, and that's sort of the little ping pong ball on the top. And then there's a non-polar side, and that's going to be the tails, okay? The polar side likes water, and the non-polar side doesn't like water. And phospholipids are made out of a phosphorus head. So there's, if you look really close right here, this is a phosphate, which is a phosphorus atom with oxygen surrounding it. And lipid means fat. So this is the phosphorus part right here, and the tails are the lipid part. Now, if I take a fat, like oils, let's say I take some vegetable oil and dump it into water. Does the oil mix up in the water? No. I see somebody shaking their head, no. So the fatty side doesn't like water. Okay, so here's what we're going to look at. Those two fatty acids are what we call non-polar. Okay, water is a polar molecule, and so that kind of means like sort of like a magnet. It's not magnetic, but it's like a magnet. Water molecules actually stick together. Okay, and so water wants to be on this side. It doesn't want to be on that side. And so that makes these things assemble by themselves. If I took a bucket of Legos and just dumped it out, they would just sit there. If I took a bucket of phospholipids and dumped them in water, they would make a membrane all by themselves. Okay, even though they're not alive, just chemically, they will assemble into membranes. So, a little bit more about this. That just make sure you know the head is polar. I'll draw these. They don't really look like this, but to help students remember, I will draw these where they look like this. Okay, let me go on to my next one. I will draw these with a heart on one side and then the two tails. So instead of a circle, I draw a heart. I draw a heart because the heart loves water. Okay? And so if you think about all these as little hearts, and what do the hearts love? They love water. That helps you understand and remember which side is wanting to stick with water. And we call something that wants to be with water hydrophilic. Okay? Phil means love, like Philadelphia is the city of love or brotherly love. If you are an audiophile, you really like really good sound equipment. Okay? So phil or phile, that means love. If it's afraid of water on this end, what do you think it's called? Hydro what? If you're afraid of something, what do we call it? It's it's a phobia. So hydrophobic, this side doesn't want to be around water. So no water on this side. Okay? No water on that side. All right, let me clear that off. We'll talk more about this. Okay? So we call these, I already talked about this at the beginning of the lecture, where these things can sort of float around in here and move. We call this the fluid mosaic. If you go, there's a form of art that goes all the way back to ancient times called a mosaic. And that's where they would take little pieces of glass or pottery or clay and sort of glue them all together, different colors, and they'd make a picture. And they'd sort of concrete that or mortar it onto a wall or a floor or whatever, and it was sort of stuck there. This is a mosaic where these are the little pieces of glass or tile or stone or whatever, and they're not cemented. Like I said, they can move around. So, I already told you this, but here are some words you need to know. Remember, hydrophilic loves water. Hydrophobic are the tails, and they don't want to be around water. So I'm going to ask you which side is hydrophilic and hydrophobic. You need to be able to tell me, well, the phosphorus head, they call this thing the head, it's polar. It wants to be around water. The hydrophilic fatty acid tails are nonpolar. They don't like being around water. So because it's polar in one spot and nonpolar in the other, it allows only certain things to pass through. And here's what it looks like when it assembles itself. You know, most living things and cells are around a lot of water, both inside and outside. So if you are wanting to sort of get, if you're water loving, and remember, that's these heart-shaped heads here. I'm trying to draw a heart sideways, and I'm not very good at it. These guys are going to sort of face the outside and face the inside, okay? If there's water everywhere, the only place to hide from water is by pointing toward each other, and so the tails point toward each other, and we see them again line up like this. So the red, sort of pink part here loves water. This area right here doesn't like water. So because there are two layers, and we call these things phospholipids, a set of these is called a phospholipid bilayer. And because of the way it's set up, some molecules can pass through it easily and others cannot. So some of the things that can pass through are lipids. Lipids can pass through your cell membrane quite easily. Hormones are lipids. So if your body is making testosterone, estrogen, thyroid stimulating hormone, prolactin, there's dozens and dozens of hormones. Hormones can go through cellular membranes because they're lipids. And hormones tell your cells what to do. All right. So again, this thing is semi-permeable. Only certain things can go through. You can see this particle here made it through the membrane. This particle here didn't make it through the membrane. What are the factors that allow it to get through the membrane? Small molecules can get through pretty easily. That's things like oxygen, CO2. Water can move through slowly. Some larger hydrophobic molecules can get through, like steroids, but usually large molecules don't get through very easily. Just some, and they have to be hydrophobic. All right. Things like ions are charged, so they don't like to go through this because of their polarity, okay? Big molecules like proteins don't go through very easily.